Good evening, everyone. Go ahead and turn over to Matthew chapter 8. If you aren't already there, Matthew 8 is where we're going to pick up tonight. On Sunday, we finished walking through Matthew 7 and the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And so we're going to pick up as we'll spend a couple minutes here at the beginning just going back and thinking a little bit big picture about the Sermon on the Mount, but then move forward in the narrative that Matthew records here. So we'll look at probably 8 and 9 and maybe even part into 10 as we move through these chapters. What we see in Matthew 8 and 9 is largely information that Mark recorded for us and that we studied as we walked through his document of the life of Jesus. And so we won't revisit all of those accounts again, but there are a few things that we want to draw out from that and then move into chapter 10. So that's kind of our plan for this evening. But before we go any further, Jason, if you would please go ahead and lead us in prayer.
Sorry. Our Father, we thank you for this day. I thank you for the beautiful weather of your creation, of the changing of the seasons, of just your hand in creation. And I thank you just for this reminder, this beautiful day that was today. I come to you now and just ask that you are with all of us this evening, that you are with our hearts and our minds. May we be able to focus on you. Father, as we give our life to you, I ask that you would watch over us, protect us, but Father, guide us in your ways. Be with this discussion, be with Andrew as he facilitates and leads us tonight, and just continue to may we bring glory to you in all that we do. It's through your Son's most holy name. Amen.
Great. Thanks, Jason. So as we take just a brief step back and think about what we've kind of set up here through Mark's account, or excuse me, through Matthew's account, this is what we've looked at initially as kind of an overview of how this body section of Matthew's document works, and these back and forth between these sections of teaching or discourse, as they're noted up here, and these sections of narrative action. And as we mentioned when we started the Sermon on the Mount, when we look at references in other Gospels, such as Luke, it appears that this teaching likely occurred in the second year of Jesus' ministry. But yet Matthew puts it at the forefront of what he's sharing about Jesus and Jesus's message. As we noted in chapter 4, there's just a few verses there where we're told about the ministry of Jesus between his baptism and when this sermon begins. And so, Matthew, as is often noted, is not necessarily trying to always record things in the exact chronicle order that they happened. But he's putting things together in an order, at least arranging at a high level in an order that puts an emphasis and a sequence to things. And so we recognize just from that perspective the significance and the importance of this opening section, this opening teaching that we know is the Sermon on the Mount, the good news of the kingdom, as we're told in the end of Matthew 4, that Jesus was about proclaiming. And so we recognize the importance of that just even from its position in his document. But I want to just think back and think about this structure to the document itself. You could find different things, like we've said before, different ways of piecing together and summarizing this lesson, this teaching that we've completed through. But I think this captures, at least to me, this captures the thrust of what Jesus has been trying to get across in this document. We recognize that the idea of righteousness and the kingdom, righteousness in the kingdom even, is really the focal point of what Jesus is trying to emphasize here. And so he begins with what we know as the Beatitudes, this summarization, if you will, of what the character of the righteous will look like, and then follows that up discussing the role of the righteous as salt and light But then the bulk of this is the challenge to fulfill righteousness, to go beyond the righteousness of the Pharisees and to fulfill the righteousness that the law was intended to produce in the first place. And three kind of key things thinking through that. The first being this idea of looking completely at the law of righteousness, not picking out certain pieces of it, not pulling things out of context, not applying other man-made perspectives on that, but to have this complete perspective of the law of righteousness and a commitment to all of that is what makes up the second half of chapter 5 with those 6 examples there. And then in chapter 6, this focus on priority and position of the kingdom and of the perspective of kingdom righteousness, ultimately summarized in verse 33 of chapter 6 with this statement about seeking first the kingdom of righteousness. And then in chapter 7, the first half of that, as we noted on Sunday, summarized here in verse 12 of chapter 7, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And the idea there, hopefully we fleshed it out well enough on Sunday, but the idea there is it's not just this one sentence that we can pull out and understand why it's important, right? This one sentence in large part represents the whole totality of what Jesus has been saying and building here. And so that's why as we know it simply as the golden rule as it gets referred to, hopefully we recognize in the larger context of all that Jesus has been saying about this, that one statement carries the weight of everything that Jesus has brought before it in terms of how we are to interact with others and how we are to fulfill the righteousness that God has had to have, or that God has called us to have, and have this perspective of loving our neighbor and honoring them as such with our actions. And so ultimately we see this call at the end of the lesson to fulfill these things in practice. And at the end of that, of course, is the challenge to choose righteousness, to discern between those things that are trying to pull you away and those people who will say, Jesus, I knew you, or Jesus, I've been doing things in your name, but ultimately not choosing the completeness of righteousness. And so he challenges his hearers to make this choice and to live accordingly. And the thing that I want us to see, just in this kind of final summary, be the last time at least that we focus on this text in our study. The thing that I want us to see is how each of these are critically important. And what we're kind of being given here is a complete picture. If we try to pursue righteousness, we try to pursue the kingdom of God, and we don't embrace all of these things, then it just unravels, right? We can't adopt the character of the righteous and try and complete the law of righteousness without also embracing the role of being salt and light. Likewise, we can't try and be salt and light and fulfill that role of righteous if we don't embody the character, if we don't have this kingdom perspective, this perspective that looks above the things of this earth. And so as we recognize, as we mentioned several times going through this, with each of these individual sections, there's a great lesson for us as we think about challenging ourselves in our commitments and those sorts of things. But what we see here is this complete picture that he's putting together of what it means to practice and to live this righteousness, the righteousness of the kingdom. And so it's this message that he ties together and delivers, Matthew does, at the beginning of his narrative, to make it very clear as Jesus progresses further that this is the message that he's carrying. This is what he's calling people to. And as we read how people respond to that and react to that, we recognize, we can look back to this and see how they're being challenged. And as we have mentioned as well multiple times through this, hopefully we see in this the same call, the same situation really faces us today as we look out and we see Christians who are proclaiming to be in the name of Jesus, who are proclaiming to do the things of God and wear that name. We see how many different ways these same failures exist today from people who show it in some ways but aren't really embracing it in fullness. And so our challenge, of course, is to make sure that we're looking at our life constantly and living these things completely, adopting all of these things and not neglecting the fullness of what Christ has challenged us with as we look at these things. Are there any other observations or comments you wanted to draw that we haven't hit on already from the Sermon on the Mount? Okay, so as we move forward from there, then we want to pick up in chapter 8. And as we've seen here or noted already in our opening kind of comments, chapters 8 and 9 detail for us a lot of things that Mark has already noted. It's interesting to note as you kind of compare the accounts between Matthew and Mark and even Luke that, though Matthew's document is longer as a whole, in many of these cases, Matthew is actually giving us less information. But he's focusing on a specific aspect of what's going on in that. And so even as you look at these accounts, it can be helpful to go back and compare across and say, okay, sometimes we have a tendency to go and look for the account that gives us more information, right? And focus on the one that gives us the most detail. But it's also interesting to stop and go through some of these cases. And when we find that Matthew or one of the other gospel writers is giving us less detail, to stop and think about why, what they're trying to focus us on, what specific aspect of that healing or that interaction are they trying to draw out. So it's interesting to do that. Like I said, we won't take the time tonight to go through all of these and do that kind of comparison, but just in your own studies, that can be an interesting way to look and compare across the text with some of these things. And so what we see in chapter 8, as Matthew starts to detail these healings and these acts, we see kind of an interesting choice of how Matthew starts off with. The first example we see is Jesus healing a leper. And when we recognize the leper, we think about it as sickness and as an affliction, right? But what unique impact does leprosy have in terms of someone under the law of Moses and the practices of this people?
They were ceremonially unclean, so they were ostracized from not only social but religious activities.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's, don't want to put too much weight when maybe it's not intended to make a major point, but it's just interesting as Matthew selects these things to record, as he's given all this talk about exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees and the way that they looked at things. That the first healing that he chooses, or the first miracle that he chooses to record of Jesus after that, is this person who's unclean. And while many would pull back from a leper because of his uncleanness, you see Jesus literally in verse 3 reaching out or stretching out. And again, don't want to put too much emphasis on that if Matthew's not being intentional about that, but at least seems possible. This visual, this perspective of Jesus going forth from this and finding this one who's unclean, and rather than pulling away from him, he reaches out, he stretches out to him to cleanse him and to remove his leprosy. And yet he still then, even though he's removed the leprosy, tells the one to go and do what he's supposed to show himself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded. So even as he takes this action, right, he's still reinforcing the practices that they were to carry out. So you go back and you think about that statement in 5:17 through 20 about not one of these things passing, right? Jesus isn't here to destroy the law and tell people to disregard it. He's here to bring it to fulfillment. And even in this little healing, you kind of get a sense of how that comes into play. The next example we see, of course, is the centurion. And what is it that stands out about the centurion and his faith in this example?
What always struck me was that Jesus marveled at the faith that this man had. And from what I can remember from the scripture, I think there's only a couple times that Jesus actually marveled at something. Of course, here in this verse 10, where it says he marveled at the faith. But I think there's one in Mark that he talks about where Jesus marveled at their kind of persistent unbelief of people. So there was kind of two things, maybe more, that he marveled at. But I remember these two, and I always thought it was kind of unique.
Yeah. Yeah, so he sees this man's faith, and we recognize, the centurion, again, this non-Jewish person, right? So this perspective of this document, being written so much focus on the person of to a Jewish background, and yet the second thing that we see Jesus doing is responding to the centurion, the soldier, outside of the people. But what we see on the part of the centurion is a both a faith of what Jesus can do, right? That you say this and it will happen. But look at verse 8. What does the centurion, how does the Roman soldier see himself in relation to Jesus or in relation to Jesus? He says, I'm not worthy, right? And so it's not just the fact that, oh, I think you can heal, or I've heard you heal and I want to be healed, right? But this centurion is recognizing his worth relative to the worth of Jesus in this case. And so, he says in verse 9, I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he does, and go to another, and comes, and to my servant, do this. And he does it. And it's that Jesus marvels seeing his faith, um, but understand again the impact of the view of worth and the worthiness that the soldier expresses here as part of that statement of finding no one in Israel who has such faith, right? So for all these people who should be anticipating this and looking for this, he finds no one in Israel who has this faith, this confidence in what Jesus can do, and this view of Jesus's worth and his worthiness to him. And so as you look at his statement here in verses 11 through 13, let's read this. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. And so what message beyond the centurion did Jesus deliver there? What was the implication of his statement in those 3 verses?
Seems as if he was indicating there's going to be others rather than just the Jews, and that some of the Jews may be cast out because of their almost unbelief. But what struck me up above in verse 9, that the guy compares himself with Jesus. He says, I'm a man under authority. He recognized Jesus had authority, and a lot of the Jews didn't recognize that. So there's several things there that stand out.
Yeah, exactly. You see the picture of authority, right? We emphasize that a lot in our study through Mark about how Jesus's authority is portrayed. And so you see this acknowledgement of his authority, this acknowledgement of his power, the soldier's view, the centurion's view, that he wasn't worthy of having Jesus in his home. And Jesus uses that to explain how there's going to be lots of people, not from this nation, who see the value in what's going on here, while those people who should see the value in Christ ultimately are rejecting it, even as they have the opportunity. And then, of course, you see the outcome explained there in verse 12 of what will happen to those who will be thrown in the outer darkness. Reader, Josh, did I cut you off?
No, not really, Andrew. I think what you just summed up was, I was going to say in a bit of a way, the idea of these verses that you ask about really shows that the kingdom, as Christ is proclaiming it, will be open to all. It's no longer reserved just for the Jews. And as you say, there are some Jews who also still will not be able to enjoy the benefits of the kingdom, even though they've looked forward to that for years and years and years, coming through their ancestors. So thank you for.
Yeah, exactly. That picture of openness, right? It's not just about condemning the Jews for not receiving this message, but also a proclamation that this is going to be open to all, right? And the key, of course, is always to remember that what distinguishes those that are being rewarded and offered hope in here, and those that are not, are ultimately those who are going to act upon what they hear and the message that is proclaimed, and come to the table, right? That's the picture that's here. Many will come from east and west and recline at the table, right? And there's some language there. I want to acknowledge that, right? It's a way of describing perhaps a larger picture. But these are people who have heard and they're responding and they're coming and they're going to be received. Whereas those who might view themselves in the position of privilege are going to be rejected for the way in which they don't respond and don't give themselves to Jesus and to his message. Other observations or comments through that? So the next example, and again, we won't go through each of these, but the next example right after this also introduces a new element for us or builds upon what's going on. So here we see now he's at Peter's house with his mother-in-law. She's sick with a fever. He touches her and heals her, and we see many else who are coming. But ultimately in verse 17, what do we recognize is one of the significance or one of the points of significance of what Jesus is doing in healing. We've emphasized in the past how this demonstrates Jesus' power and authority and his control over things. But what does verse 17 help draw our attention to?
Drew, that he's fulfilling a prophecy.
Yeah, he's fulfilling this prophecy. We see this quotation referenced from Isaiah. And interestingly, where in Isaiah is it? It's Isaiah 53, if you look at your reference there. And so this passage that, is often brought up and often mentioned in reference to Jesus's suffering is brought up here to actually emphasize the part of that passage where Jesus is responding to his people. I mean, let's just turn over there for a second. As we turn back to Isaiah 53, the quote in Matthew just reads a little bit different than what we recognize it in the way that Isaiah records it here. And we won't read all of Isaiah 53, but in the midst of this section where he's describing in verse 3 how he's despised and rejected, he's a man of sorrow, he's a one from whom men hide their faces. And then later on, the talking about how he's oppressed and afflicted and all these things that are going to happen to him. In the midst of this, what is he doing? In verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And so we, reading through Isaiah 53, we may recognize a spiritual sense, right, in which that's through. This theme that's playing out in Isaiah is, the scene that we understand of Jesus's crucifixion, his sacrifice. And we might look at that and read that statement in verse 4 about how Jesus is dealing with our sin problem, right? And he's taking these things on and he's bearing these things on. But what Matthew helps us see is that statement is also connected to the physical suffering that Jesus is relieving here. As Jesus is doing these things, Matthew helps us see that this is fulfilling, or at least part of the fulfillment of what the servant, we focus on the suffering from that passage, but it's a passage of the suffering servant. What the servant is doing is seeing the needs of his people, how they're afflicted, how they're sorrowful, how they're stricken with illness and disease, and he's responding favorably to that and bearing that and taking those things away from those who would bring them. So it's just, at least for me, it's an interesting element to add to that passage where, like I said, you read Isaiah 53 sometimes on its own and perhaps don't recognize that in the midst of that is the statement that is even talking about how Jesus would physically respond to the needs of his people and their sorrows and their afflictions. Other observations?
I think just all this speaks to compassion of Jesus. And sometimes I think as individuals, we may be more or less compassionate related to some things than other things. But, Jesus had compassion both for the physical frailties of humankind, as well as the sin problem. I mean, it's the same motivation to help each need of mankind. And sometimes maybe I think we may get too focused. Maybe too focused isn't the right word, but we're so focused on the sin problems that we forget that we should be compassionate towards people's physical suffering as well. And oftentimes it's taking care of people's physical sufferings that helps us have the opportunity to help them with their sin suffering. One can be a door to the other. And anyway, but Jesus is very, I guess, holistic, maybe a term, in terms of he was touched by all kinds of infirmities and needs. I know at times I'm, that's an area I can be lacking. I need more of that. So anyway, I appreciate his example in that.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we can have a tendency to look down on certain problems as being lesser problems. And it's not necessarily coming from a distorted perspective, in the sense that, we do recognize that there are greater problems, greater concerns than the physical sufferings of this world. In fact, that point's going to be made in chapter 10, where he tells them not to fear the one who can kill the body, but fear the one who can kill the body of soul. But in the perspective that we need to keep of lesser problems and greater problems, if you will, we can't have this attitude of looking down on the lesser problems, because when you're suffering with those things, right, they don't seem like the lesser problems oftentimes, right? And if people don't see how we care about the lesser problems, then they're probably not going to be as interested in what we have to say about the greater problems. And Jesus shows, as you said, John, the compassion for both of those problems in what he did and in his work. And so as we go through, the rest of this chapter and into chapter 9, we see Jesus making several statements here that challenge and kind of prod people forward to think about their faith and what kind of faith that they have, building on that idea of the centurion. And so in 18 through 22, we have Jesus going around, and we have these two examples of guys who are coming up and asking to follow him. And Jesus is challenging, you're concerned about these things, but don't be concerned about that. You don't know where you're going to lie your head down. Leave the dead to bury themselves. And so another challenging statement, just like he's made as he started with that encounter with the centurion, and challenged the faith and the commitment that others have. Then you see him calming the storm, right? And, interesting observation that I missed for a while. In one sense, you see the disciples here, and on the surface of this, we look at this as just a lack of faith, right? But in fact, they actually go to Jesus seemingly knowing that he can do something, or maybe it shouldn't go quite that far, right? Because they don't actually say, well, they do say, save us, right? And so, they do go to Jesus, right? And so there's some expectation that they have on him, and yet he responds to them with the words of what, as you look there in verse 26, "Oh, you of little faith." And so though they have the awareness to go to Jesus and ask him to rescue, there's still a littleness of their faith, because of, as he draws out here, even though he calms the winds and calms the sea here, right? They forgot who they were with from a larger perspective, and were overwhelmed by this immediate perspective of what the sea and what might happen. And it kind of echoes a little bit, I think, at least in my mind, going back to chapter 6, where he talks about being concerned with the things of this earth, right? And drawing their attention to the sparrows and the lilies of the field, and what they're focused on, and don't let life be about these things. He doesn't come out and explicitly state in this example in what way he's referring to their faith as little, but you can't help, I think, a little bit and think back to that direction, that statement, and say here again, like, this is perhaps for their focus, though they recognize the specialness of him, are still missing the picture of who he is and what he's trying to do. And so he responds, even as they acknowledge him in some way, he responds to them as being of little faith. Reader, Josh?
It's me this time, Drew. But don't you think there are times, even now, when we struggle with having all the faith we need at any given point in time, because life is so much going on sometimes, that even though we know what we know about God and his promises in Christ and what he has told us, there are times when we just are beaten down that we say, save us, because we we just need help.
Right. Yeah, we get overwhelmed. The seas look big, and we don't see how this ends. We don't see how this plays out. Perhaps sometimes it's the perspective of we don't even know how to move forward.
Hmm.
Right? When you're in a situation and that feeling of helplessness sets in because you don't see what path you can take, you don't see what step you can take, you feel this sense of utter and complete lack of control, right? And
Right.
what we want to be is removed from the situation oftentimes because we don't see the path forward. And again, I don't know exactly what he's trying to draw out here, but seemingly they want to be removed from the situation, and
Mm.
and he's challenging them that their faith doesn't recognize that there will be a path forward, and that they have to have that confidence in him and whatever that path might be. So I don't know if that gets
Right.
exactly to what you're pointing out there, but yeah, we can
Yes,
react the same way,
exactly.
right? Even though we have this kind of awareness of Jesus's promises and even perhaps of God's plan at a macro level, we still can feel
Right.
lost in the midst of that.
Drew,
Amen.
Drew, can I chime in?
Yeah, Josh.
Um, so my observation is probably a little bit different from the sense of this seems very different for these particular disciples. And this is without me having and thinking in my mind through all the context of the first year of Jesus' ministry. I'm thinking of Matthew and what we've seen Christ do in Matthew. So the majority, even though they've seen him do very miraculous things, the majority of those things, if I'm not mistaken, had nothing to do with nature as a different object, healing the body, doing things for people, even raising. I'm not sure he's raised the dead yet. So I think of the turning water into wine. That's something a little bit more of earthly, but this is just nature, kind of how we would say Mother Nature. And so it may be something very different for them. They're saying, how is Jesus really going to handle this? It's not the same experience that they've had with him in the other miracles that he's done. And I could see that causing a little bit of doubt. That's just supposition, but just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good observation. I mean, a little bit hard to know exactly when these things, how they sequence and relate to other things, but certainly their comment seems to indicate that right in verse 27, where they've understand that he can do something, right, and so that's why they've appealed to
Right.
him. But perhaps they had limits in terms of how much they thought he could do. Perhaps seeing this as a greater challenge than what they've already encountered, and not recognizing that.
Andrew, I think sometimes that, I know what the scriptures say, that trust him and what he has to say, and perhaps a means of getting through, but yet I think sometimes our feelings or emotions get the best of us and kind of neutralize us a little bit and from remembering what we all remember.
Right. Yep. Yeah, it's easy to get in the midst of those situations caught up in places where our emotion overrides our understanding. Mhm. And so this idea of running with this idea of progression a little bit in what Jesus is doing. So we see the waves and the winds being calmed by him and controlled by him. Then Matthew gives us the account of him casting not just one demon, but this demon, this large group of demons into the pigs. And he follows that up then in a climactic way almost in chapter 9, then of course, with Jesus saying that he's healing the sins of this paralytic that's brought to him. And so we see that they bring the paralytic lying on the bed, and again, this is one of those cases where we actually have more detail in some of the other account of this, but they see this paralytic being brought to him. And so Jesus tells him, your sins are forgiven. And of course, there's the crowd around this who recognizes this as blaspheming. They know that only God can forgive these sins. And so Jesus ultimately demonstrates through his healing of the body that he even has the power to heal sins. And so that idea of authority, in verse 6, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He then said to the paralytic, rise, pick up your bed, and go home. And the response to the crowds, of course, is one of what in verse 7? They rise, they go home, they see it in verse 8, and they were afraid, and they glorified God, who had given such authority to men. Right? So this idea of how these works are kind of building on one another to show people the extent to which God has granted this one to have authority over all these things. And positively, right, they glorify God because of this. And one of the kind of themes to think about through here, as we talked about a little bit with Mark, is being prepared and thinking about the idea of the fact that the people are responding positively, at least many people are responding positively to this message and what Jesus is doing. But we know that's not going to last, right? And so one of the things that we look for as we go throughout this document, not to see it necessarily right here, but seeing how they're glorifying God here, and then thinking as we go along, what gets in the way, right? What interferes when they can react so positively at first when they see these things and they hear about these things. But ultimately, that's going to fade in many cases, or even most cases. And so as we go along, right, be thinking about what is it that changes? Why does this excitement not last on the part of the people? Do pause there, other observations from those accounts? So in verse 9, we move away or move on now from some of the works that Jesus is doing here in these last three accounts, and then in the three before that, before Jesus talks about following. And you see this kind of sequence, just by the way, in some of Matthew's sections where it's pretty deliberate or seems to be deliberate. In chapter 8, you begin with 3 healings, and then you have this statement about following him. And then you get 3 more healings, or 3 more works of Jesus, I should say. And then we have this next statement about following him. And so, just how Matthew structures some of what he's doing here, it's interesting to note that a little bit, because there seems to be an intentional progression in some of these things. But now, as he focuses on this idea of following in the second description here, it's where he's calling Matthew, right? And Matthew's literally doing what when Jesus calls him?
Collecting taxes.
Collecting taxes, right? And we recognize, hopefully, from maybe past studies or discussions at least, the connection between this idea of sin and the tax collectors and the tax collecting. And why I think, just to make that point here, is it's kind of like saying Jesus calls him in the act. He's not just telling us the geographic location of Matthew. Matthew is in the tax booth doing the thing that is so often connected with sin, right? And so it's kind of just an interesting picture there. He's literally in the act of collecting the taxes. He's sitting in the tax booth. And it's in the midst of that Jesus says, follow me. And we see then Matthew responds and he follows him. But at the scene afterwards, a couple things to notice. What impact does the following of Matthew have on others? What else is going on now? Or who else, I should say, is around now?
Other tax collectors and sinners came to Jesus. They saw something, that they needed,
Exactly. So, without reading too much into it, Jesus sees something in Matthew and calls him to follow him. but we see the impact that Jesus is reaching out to this person who's caught up in this function that is so connected with sin and dishonesty and greed and all these other things. Jesus reaching out to that person, and the way that that person responds then has a ripple effect, right? Thinking back to the idea of the role of righteousness in Matthew 5 about being salt and light. And so this reaching out that Jesus does to this tax collector turns into more of an opportunity to sit down and recline with other tax collectors and sinners. And so, that challenge that we often have to look at someone and see them as caught up as sin, and the tendency, at least for me oftentimes, is to say, well, they won't be interested in this message, right? As if someone has to have already rid themselves of sin in some way to be responsive to the message. Jesus sees something in Matthew that will respond to this message, but he likely also sees that when that one responds, it's going to have an impact on others. And so it's not just that now Jesus has called Matthew, Jesus is now calling all tax collectors and sinners, and they see that if he's willing to sit and recline and talk and reason with this one, then it opens the door for others to hear and listen and interact. And so even just stopping there, right, there's an important lesson in this example. But what's the second half of this that's important to understand as the Pharisees come in?
Well, they're doing their unrighteous judgment thing.
Yeah.
They say, well, Jesus is hanging out with publicans and sinners, and they seem to jump to the conclusion that, well, that's who Jesus prefers to hang out with. He's must not be all that righteous himself. This seems to be the tone of their question. But the fact is that Jesus had something that sinners wanted, and the sinners were coming to him. And I mean, I love this example. Luke brings it out 2-3 times. That the sinners and the publicans and so forth, they come to Jesus, and then he's there eating and with them. And then the Pharisees ask, well, why is he eating with them? Well, because they're the lost, they're the sick ones. He came to seek and save that's lost. And to me, it's always a personal challenge. If there are people that have spiritual needs, are they going to see me as a person that they should come to talk about it with? Or do they see me as the Pharisee that is just going to condemn them? Anyway, to me, this is an awesome example. I get challenged a lot by it.
Yeah, exactly. You see, again, we'll probably continue to do this, thinking about how Matthew 5-7 shows up in so many of these other things through the rest of the text. But think about the first 5 verses in Matthew 7, where Jesus talks about the speck and the log in your eyes and the way in which we judge. They're making this judgment against these people and against Jesus in this context, right? Of what he's doing against this. Jesus turns that around and points out both their failure to recognize who they are in this picture, but also then to recognize that who the Messiah is coming for. Again, going back even to Matthew 5, the character, the Beatitudes of one is that those who recognize that they are sick and they are in need. And so, it's easy to see where the Pharisees come from, right? We're harsh on them. We view them as hypocritical because we have the hindsight in the situation. But yet at the same time, it's easy for us to see where they come from in the sense that, what we want to do is say, I don't want to be involved in this. I don't want to be connected to these things. And it's good for us not to be connected into the sin, right? But we need to be connected and committed to the sinner. And that's the distinction that has to be made. That what they fail to recognize is that difference between the sin and the sinner. They're right in saying don't be involved with the sin, but they fail to see the need of the sinner and to respond appropriately in that case. And so rather than recognizing, hey, this guy may have an influence on them, they condemn them for him possibly getting involved in something that might be, or not might, but would be viewed negatively and looked down upon. other observations or comments through that
I
example?
think it's great he has the opportunity to teach both groups, and especially kind of bringing out, the idea of compassion, that love, to help save those folks, those sinners, and to help them in that way. And that's exactly, in fact, what the Pharisees were probably supposed to be doing their job, in which they weren't really doing their job. So he, in some sense, he was rebuking them also, and kind of showing them up, you could say.
Yeah. And it's important that we recognize in this example, a couple of distinctions, of course, like we've already made, but even going a step further, some people come to examples like this and they'll try and paint this picture of, Jesus who would just go and hang out in the midst of anything. And I hope, of course, that we recognize the context of, through what we've read already, that if Jesus is telling someone, follow me, he's probably challenging them really hard, right? So this isn't a picture of Jesus just going casually and socially in the midst of these others. He's challenged them, but to the extent that they're responding and listening, he continues to engage. And that's the key thing to note, as Matthew puts this together. He's told Matthew, follow me. That's what instigates this. We can know what Jesus would have been saying and challenging in his teachings and his words after that. And it's the fact that they've come and they're listening and they're hearing, that Jesus continues with them rather than saying, I'm not going to be part of that. All right, well, we will pick up there at the second half of chapter 9 then on Sunday. Our plan will be to work through chapters 9 and the rest of chapter 10. As you're looking through chapter 10, it's interesting. This is another one of those kind of teaching discourse sections. And part of what's interesting here is as you read it, right, from our Mark study, it should sound familiar. But we recognize that a lot of what Jesus says here, when he says it's in Mark, it's in a slightly different context, right? Later in his ministry, towards the end, right before his crucifixion. And so it's interesting to kind of compare those if you want to look back and forth between Mark 13, where some of these things are said, but understand the context in which Jesus is saying these things in the moment in Matthew's narrative is as he's sending out the 12 here. And kind of as we alluded to earlier in our class already, part of what we see beginning in this section in Matthew 10 is this idea that, the people have responded, right? We've noted that already, how they're glorifying God. But Jesus in chapter 10 is really going to start to dig into the fact that this response isn't going to last, right? It's not going to be all roses. And people just giving themselves to God, they're going to start rejecting that. And so, chapter 10 is where he really, in Matthew's narrative, really starts to dive into the idea that, though it's been largely a positive scene so far in the narrative in terms of how people are responding, chapter 10 starts to get into the fact that this message isn't going to be one that just brings everybody together under a single banner. This is going to be a message that challenges people. Some are going to reject the message, and the message is going to divide the people, not because the message is divisive, but because some people are going to reject that message. And so he's going to get in this narrative in chapter 10 and start to bring that out and flesh that out more for his apostles and followers. So we'll work more on that on Sunday, Lord willing. Anything else for our class tonight, Ben? All right, if not, we'll jump over to the link for announcements. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.